My grandfather buried a secret so deep it nearly died with him. He swore that he saw Bigfoot, and what he recounted on his deathbed was so meticulous that I began to understand why this man had carried this secret in absolute silence for all of his life. I had driven 4 hours to the hospital and now sat by the bed watching my grandfather breathe. Walter Hale, my 86-year-old grandpa, felt compelled to tell someone before he died about his secret encounter. It was the summer of 1967. Grandpa was 28, newly married, and working a contract surveying old-growth forest near the Canadian border. His job was simple: walk the grid, mark the trees, record estimates, measure, not care. After 3 hours and roughly 4 miles with compass and clipboard in hand, he noticed something moving to his left. It was not an alarming awareness at first, but this was different in a way that his body registered before his conscious mind did. He noticed it first as a change in his own breathing, a slight involuntary tension across his shoulders, the kind of physical response that precedes understanding. He kept walking, and the movement kept pace with him, parallel to his direction of travel, maybe 30 or 40 feet into the trees. Whatever it was large. He could hear the displacement of it, the soft compression of deadfall underfoot, the occasional low sweep of a branch being pushed rather than brushed. Not a small animal working through the undergrowth, but something with mass, moving with purpose. He stopped, and the movement also stopped. He stood still for a full minute, listening, his head turned slightly to the left, tracking the silence. There was nothing, no continuation of movement, no retreat, no sound at all from that section of the trees. Whatever it was had stopped when he stopped, and was now waiting with the same stillness he was trying to project. And that quality, the matching of his pause, the deliberate mirroring of his own stillness, was the first thing that separated this from a bear or an elk. Animals did not do that. Animals either moved away from you or moved toward you. They did not wait with you, and if this thing was not behaving like an animal, he could not say what rules it was playing by or whether those rules left any room for him to walk away. He started walking again. The movement resumed within a few steps, matching his pace with that same almost deliberate quality. Not rushing, not retreating, not varying its distance, just keeping pace and tracking him through the trees as though it had somewhere specific to be, and that somewhere happened to be parallel to wherever he was going. Grandpa was not a man prone to irrational fear. He ran through the catalog of reasonable explanations methodically, the way his professional training had taught him to work through problems. Bear, elk, deer, another hiker moving through the understory on a parallel line. A bear was the most plausible. He had encountered bears before, twice at close range, once badly enough that he had a small, pale scar on his left forearm as a souvenir of the encounter and a healthy respect for the species ever after. He unclipped the strap on his pack, moved the bear spray from its side pocket to his right hand, and kept walking, telling himself he was being sensible in the slightly performative way people talk to themselves when they are beginning to be afraid and do not want to admit it. Then he saw it. He was passing between two large firs when the angle opened up and the underbrush thinned enough that he had a clear sight line for perhaps 50 feet into the trees. And standing between two of those trees, partially in shadow but fully visible, not hiding, not moving, simply standing there as though it had been standing there for some time and had no objection to being seen, was something that was not a bear, not an elk, and not anything he had a word for. It was upright, not rearing like a startled bear, but standing the way a person stands when they're not thinking about it, weight settled, posture easy. Grandpa had a surveyor's instinct for measurement, and he put it at 8, maybe 8.5 feet. Dark brown hair, nearly black in the low light, thick across the torso, finer on the face. The arms were wrong, too long, hanging well past where a human's would end, the hands large enough to see clearly at distance, shoulders impossibly wide, almost no neck. The head was slightly conical at the crown, the face broad and flat, the brow ridge heavy enough to throw its own shadow across the upper face. It was looking at him, not in the way an animal looks at a person, not the quick, skittish assessment of a deer clocking a threat and calculating exit routes, not the hard, territorial evaluation of a bear deciding whether you're worth the energy. This was slower and steadier than either of those things, and it had a quality of attention that Grandpa found more unsettling than either aggression or fear would have been. The eyes were amber brown, set deep under that heavy brow, catching what little light filtered down through the canopy, and they moved across him with a patience and deliberateness that he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe accurately to himself in private, never to anyone else. The closest he ever got, decades later in that hospital room, with my wrist in his hand, was intelligent assessment, the way a person looks at something unfamiliar that they are genuinely trying to understand, taking their time, forming no premature conclusions. Bigfoot held its position for what Grandpa estimated was between 10 and 15 seconds. Though time had become unreliable in the specific way it becomes unreliable in moments of extreme stress, compressing and stretching in ways that make honest estimation nearly impossible. Then, with no urgency whatsoever, and with the same unhurried ease that characterized everything it did, it turned and stepped back into the shadows between the trees and was simply gone, not running, not crashing away through the undergrowth the way large animals usually retreat, but stepping back and ceasing to be visible the way a person steps back from a window, a controlled and deliberate exit on its own terms and in its own time. Grandpa stood in the trail for a long moment without moving. His hands were shaking badly enough that he gripped the bear spray with both of them, just to hold it. His body hadn't processed the leaving. It was still fully committed to the looking, still running every emergency protocol the sight of that thing had triggered, completely uninterested in the logical observation that nothing bad had actually happened. He decided to turn around and take the 4 miles back to the truck slowly and calmly, finish his notes from memory, submit the survey, and collect his fee. And he would never tell anyone what he'd seen because he didn't have any language for it that wouldn't make him sound like a man who'd lost his mind in Whatcom County. Though he could not quite work out how a man was supposed to walk slowly and calmly for 4 miles through a forest where something that had just studied him was still listening for every footstep. He took 3 steps, and that was when the roar happened. Left side, close, 15 feet into the trees at most, and it was the loudest sound he had ever heard a living thing produce, though volume wasn't the whole of it. There was a sub-bass frequency that didn't travel through the air so much as through the ground, up through his boots and his skeleton and into his chest, a sound that didn't enter his body as much as occupy it. He reached for the loudest industrial machinery he'd ever worked around as a reference point and found it inadequate, and beyond the volume there was something communicative in it. Not language, not words, but not pure animal reflex either. Something that carried specific intent, the way a shout carries anger across a language barrier. You understand nothing of the words and everything of the meaning. He ran, which was not a decision. His legs were moving before his mind had registered that he was moving, before any conscious instruction had been issued. A full panicked sprint back up the trail the way he had come, pack bouncing hard on his shoulders, his clipboard spinning free and landing somewhere in the undergrowth behind him, branches slapping his arms and face hard enough to leave marks he would find later. He was a good runner, long-legged, fit, with solid trail experience, and for about 10 seconds he ran as fast as he had ever run in his life, though if 10 seconds of his best effort was all it took to exhaust the advantage, he did not want to know what was waiting for him at the end of those 10 seconds. The Sasquatch didn't emerge. It erupted. One moment there were only trees. The next it was already sprinting, the ground shuddering with each stride. It wasn't chasing him. It was cutting him off. Grandpa tried to turn, slipped, and lost control. As it crossed his path, one arm swept back almost casually and struck his pack, flinging him off the trail into the brush. He crashed hard, rolling through roots and rock before stopping against an embankment, ribs screaming, ears ringing. He ran a quick check, breathing, thinking, moving, damaged but intact. When he pushed himself up, it was already there below him, massive, breathing slow and heavy. The smell reached him, musk, wet fur, pine, and something older. It didn't advance. It simply stood, watching, its stillness more unsettling than the sprint had been. Then it roared again, shorter, sharper, aimed straight at him. Teeth rattled, ears screamed, skull pulsed with pressure. Back against the embankment with nowhere to go, Grandpa let out a raw, uncontrollable scream, the only release his body could produce. Bigfoot went completely still. It stopped mid-breath, every motion ceasing at once, the slow rise and fall of the chest, the slight movement of the head, all of it simply stopping as though something had been switched off. It stared up at him. Grandpa stared back down at it. The echo of his own scream faded into the trees, and the silence that replaced it was the most complete silence he had ever been inside. A silence so total it had its own texture. Then he heard the trees moving. Not the wind, which had been still all morning, and not birds, but something moving through the undergrowth on multiple sides simultaneously. The soft percussion of heavy footfalls on forest floor, the low displacement of brush, the barely perceptible vibration in the embankment against his back that told him something large was moving upslope behind him. The sounds approached from different directions at once, unhurried and coordinated, and within perhaps 20 seconds, 3 more Sasquatch had emerged from the forest at different points around him, with the quiet authority of things that had been nearby for some time and had simply decided to stop being invisible. One stepped out to his right, coming from the downhill side of the trail, broad and deliberate. One emerged directly ahead, stepping from between 2 large cedars with the calm, unhurried ease of something that had no reason to rush, because rushing was for things that were uncertain about the outcome. And one came from behind him and slightly upslope. He heard it before he turned to look, heard the weight of it on the slope, and when he did turn, he found himself looking up at the largest living thing he had ever stood near, positioned upslope and behind him from the beginning, which meant that almost nothing about what had just happened had been anything other than exactly what they intended. Grandpa turned in a slow circle and understood with a precision that left no room for hope or negotiation that he was completely surrounded. He tried to assess them because the surveyor in him was apparently unkillable. The Sasquatch that had attacked him, the lean, fast one still standing at the base of the embankment, was the smallest of the 4, and the word smallest was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. It had a longer-legged, narrower build than the others, built for speed in a way the others were not, and Grandpa thought, in some detached and somewhat hysterical corner of his mind, that he understood now why running had been so completely useless. The one to his right was broader and shorter by several inches, heavier through the chest and neck, built for something other than speed. The one directly ahead was female. He was reasonably certain of this based on structural differences he noticed without intending to, and filed away with the same professional precision he filed everything else. And the one from upslope was enormous in a way that made the others seem almost ordinary by comparison. Something close to 9 feet tall, he estimated, with a breadth of shoulder that the word massive was not quite large enough to contain. None of them moved toward him. They stood at the intervals at which they had arrived, distributed evenly around him, watching with that same quality of patient, focused attention he had first encountered in the initial sighting. There was no aggression in their postures, no display, no sound. They simply stood and looked at him with the collective calm of things that had already decided what they were doing and were now simply doing it. He was the unfamiliar thing here, the thing being studied, and that understanding did not dissolve his terror so much as change its character, move it from pure, blank animal panic towards something more complex, something that had room in it for questions he had no answers to. He had his back against the embankment and both hands raised, the universal gesture of harmlessness that he had no particular reason to believe was universal, and he was hyperventilating badly enough that his vision was beginning to whiten at the edges. He counted his exhales deliberately, not because he was composed, he was nowhere near composed, but because losing consciousness in this particular situation seemed like an extraordinarily bad idea. The largest Sasquatch moved, though not with urgency. Each step was measured and deliberate, placed with a care that read as intentional restraint, as though speed were a form of communication it was consciously choosing not to employ. It came up the embankment to his left rather than approaching straight on, circled slightly as it came, and settled into a position 6 feet in front of him on the same level. Close enough that Grandpa could see the individual hairs along its jaw, the deep creasing of dark skin around its eyes, the slow, regular expansion and contraction of its chest. Close enough that the smell was no longer something he was encountering, but something he was inside, and the deliberate care of the approach, the visible restraint of it, raised a question he could not answer, whether it was trying not to frighten him, and if so, why it needed him calm. The large Sasquatch looked at him with a sustained, unhurried examination, not a glance, not a threat assessment, but the kind of focused, patient attention that belongs to something that is genuinely trying to understand what it is looking at and is in no hurry to stop until it does. Grandpa estimated 30 seconds of direct eye contact, which is a very long time under any circumstances and an almost incomprehensible amount of time under these ones. Then it made a sound, not a roar, something categorically different from either of the roars. It was low and rhythmic, with a vowel quality to it that Grandpa could not describe more precisely than that. A deep resonant vocalization that seemed to originate somewhere below the chest, below the diaphragm, from a depth of body that implied a physiology built for sounds that human vocal architecture couldn't approach. He had no framework for it, could not have reproduced it, and could not even be certain afterward that he had heard all of it, or that the full range of it had been within his hearing. But its effect on the other 3 Bigfoot was immediate and absolute. They went still and quiet all at once, in the way that a room full of people goes quiet when the one person with actual authority speaks, a hush that was not the absence of noise so much as the presence of deference. The large Sasquatch did not look away from Grandpa when it made the sound, its eyes remaining on his face throughout, with that same patient, examining attention, as though his reaction to the vocalization was part of what was being assessed. Then the sound stopped, and the silence that followed it was different from the silence before, denser, more resolved, the silence of something decided rather than something paused. Then the large Sasquatch turned and walked into the forest, not away from him and not retreating, but walking in a specific direction where it took 3 deliberate steps and stopped and looked back at him over one massive shoulder. Grandpa had spent enough time in the field reading terrain and tracking lines of sight to know the difference between something that was leaving and something that was leading, and this was the latter. The lean, fast one moved from the base of the embankment to a position at his left, close enough that he could feel the displacement of air from its presence, not threatening but escorting, and the broad one on his right shifted subtly to complete the arrangement. They were not giving him a choice, but they were not being rough about the fact that they were not giving him a choice, which seemed, in context, like the best he could hope for. So Grandpa walked. He walked for what he estimated was close to a mile, trying to track direction and terrain the way his training demanded, because his mind needed something to do other than panic. Northeast, he thought, deeper into the forest, away from any trail he knew, while the large Sasquatch led ahead of him with a fluid ease that made the undergrowth seem to rearrange itself rather than resist. And the others stayed close without touching him and without making a sound. He smelled it before he saw it. Wood smoke, but old, banked and familiar. Nothing like the acrid bite of a new fire, and underneath that, something organic and layered, the smell of a place that was lived in, of accumulated presence, of warmth generated not by sun, but by bodies. And beneath even that something he had no name for, something that reminded him of turned earth in spring and deep root systems and the particular dark smell of ground that has not been disturbed in a very long time. He stepped through a dense stand of old-growth cedar and stopped. The hollow was large, 3 or 4 acres, he estimated automatically, the surveyor in him measuring before he could stop it. Sheltered on all sides by ancient trees whose canopy knit together overhead into a natural vault that blocked the sky entirely. The ground was soft and cleared of undergrowth, packed down by use over what he instinctively understood was not years, but generations. And in that hollow, settled into the roots and rock formations and the natural contours of the terrain with an integration so complete that Grandpa had to look twice to understand what he was seeing, was a community. Not shelters in any human sense, not constructed in any way that word usually implies, but organized, deliberately, intelligently organized, around the landscape's existing features. Large roots hollowed by age and use, rock overhangs deepened into protected spaces, branches woven together overhead into canopies that shed rain. The whole thing built not by imposing structure on the forest, but by reading the forest structure and extending it, the way a master craftsman works with the grain of the wood rather than against it. And there were Bigfoot everywhere. He counted later from memory, somewhere between 20 and 30, though he was not certain he had seen all of them. Adults in various sizes, moving through the hollow with the unhurried ease of people going about ordinary business, pausing to look at him with the same quality of patient attention the others had shown. Some were seated in groups on the exposed roots of ancient trees in arrangements that read unmistakably as companionship, not resting, not merely occupying the same space, but together in some way he recognized without being able to fully name. Some were occupied with tasks he could not categorize. Some were simply still, watching him with amber eyes from the deeper shadows. And then there were the children. That was the word his mind produced, and he could not find a more accurate one. Smaller, much smaller, some of them barely waist height on the adults, with rounder faces and wider eyes, and that particular quality of held stillness that children have when they are being told with body language that something requires it. They watched him from behind adults, from the shadows of root shelters, from the elevated positions of low rock outcroppings, their eyes amber and curious, fixed on him with a directness the adults shared, but that carried in the younger ones something the adults had long since learned to temper. Wonder, simple and undisguised, the wonder of something that had not yet learned it needed to be careful. Grandpa stood at the edge of that hollow and felt something rearrange itself in him, quietly and without drama, the way large realizations move, not like a wave, but like a tide, a slow and total shift that you notice only once it is already complete. He thought about the survey grid, about the orange flagging tape he had been tying to trees for 3 hours, which marked the outer boundary of the proposed harvest zone and told the logging crews where to start. He thought about the clipboard that had spun out of his hands somewhere in the undergrowth, the one with the boundary maps and the timber estimates and the access road proposals. He thought about Cascadia Pacific Lumber and their permits and projections and ambitions, and then he thought about what those ambitions, applied to this particular forest, would produce. Logging roads punched through old growth, the systematic and methodical clearing that followed, the way a survey became a permit became a contract became machinery, and machinery became stumps and slash piles, and a landscape so altered that nothing that had lived there before could live there after. And then he looked at what was living in that forest, had apparently always been living in that forest, 3 miles from a road, invisible not because they were hiding, but because no one had known to look, and no one had known to look because they had never given anyone a reason to. Until today, until a surveyor with a clipboard and orange flagging tape walked a grid into their territory and began, with complete professional diligence, to mark the boundaries of their destruction. The large Sasquatch had turned and was watching him from 20 feet away, and Grandpa looked at it for a long moment, at those amber eyes, at the patient and complete intelligence behind them. And then he looked around the hollow one more time. The children at the edges of the firelight, the adults watching him with something that was not threat and not pleading, but something between and beyond both, something he recognized from every negotiation he had ever sat across a table from, the expression of someone who has made themselves vulnerable in order to make a point and is waiting to see if the point lands. Nodded, not knowing if the gesture meant nodded, not knowing if the gesture meant anything to them, not knowing if they had any framework for it, but offering it as deliberately and as completely as he could while holding the large one's gaze. The large Sasquatch held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned its back. The turned back was a statement, and the statement was that this was finished and he was alive, and they were leaving now. Grandpa had spent 28 years reading the body language of people and animals and the physical world itself, and he had never encountered a gesture whose meaning he was more certain of while being completely unable to explain his certainty. What he perceived was something that felt like the acknowledgement of an agreement entered into, and then it turned, and the forest took it, and Grandpa was alone. He walked out of the hollow on his own, no escort, the forest receiving him back the way it received everything, without ceremony, without any indication that it had ever held anything remarkable. He found his pack where it had fallen from his shoulders and did not look for his clipboard, because some things were better left where they landed. He walked for 4 miles with broken ribs and a ringing skull, and he used every step to think, not about what he had seen, which had resolved into something so clear it required no further analysis, but about what he was going to do about it, and by the time he reached the truck, he had decided. He drove to a payphone outside a hardware store in Blaine and called the project manager at Cascadia Pacific and told the man that the tract was unsuitable for harvest, unstable terrain, significant erosion risk, access challenges that would make the operation economically impractical. He used the language of professional assessment, and he used it precisely, giving them nothing to push back on, a conclusion that served their bottom line well enough that they would not spend money verifying it, then drove home and never did another survey for a timber company. He was going to honor that bet the same way he had been honored by it. Silence for silence. He had been shown something, and he was going to protect it in the same way it had been protected. The timber company eventually found another tract. The forest remained standing. Grandpa's hand was still holding my wrist when he finished. The monitors kept their soft rhythm. His grip on my wrist loosened slowly, and sometime before 6 in the morning, he breathed out one last time and did not breathe in again.